I'm Ben Eagle, the Adult Services Librarian here. And Jerry talked to me a while back and let me know that his book was coming out about Jim Bridger. And I was super excited to hear about that because I have to admit, I hadn't heard of him at that time. But after reading about it, it soon seems he's big in proportion to like someone like Daniel Boone, big figure in the American West. So super excited to have Jerry Enzler here, founding director of the National Mississippi River Museum, served for 37 years and 40 years as the president of the Dubuque County Historical Society. So I'm going to welcome Jerry, and he'll talk about his book, and we'll learn about Jim Bridger. Thank you.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here today, especially in my hometown of Dubuque, to talk to people not only from Dubuque, but from across the country. I got started in this pursuit many years ago, and it goes back to a day where I was watching the movie Jeremiah Johnson, and I was so taken by the drama and the lifestyle, and Robert Redford played the part beautifully. If you've seen the movie, you'll know what I mean. And if you haven't seen it, I certainly recommend it. I was so enthused that I went to the library the next morning. We were in Clarksdale, Mississippi. We were working on a mission project. And I looked for what I could find about Jeremiah Johnson. I couldn't find very much. It was a small library. But I kept finding these references, usually in about the third paragraph of almost every book of the West that was in that section where I was reading. And they said people like Jim Bridger and Kit Carson, and I'm thinking, I know Kit Carson, I don't know Jim Bridger. And so it became really at first just a curiosity. Who is Jim Bridger? And I started to find segments, books where he was told more about or more described at more length. And I just became so enthused. I'm going to read to you a statement. Somebody said, this happens to be when Bridger was maybe in his 50s. The person who's saying this is Stevenson, who was actually an anthropologist for the Smithsonian Institution, and Bridger was the guide for that group. Stevenson said that he and Bridger tented and hunted together, he hunting for game as meat, and I, meaning Stevenson, in the capacity of assistant naturalist in quest of mammals and birds for the Smithsonian Institution. I had no idea that Jim Bridger would be guiding scientists from the Smithsonian. Stevenson said, I started to study Bridger, quote, almost as an object himself of natural history. He said, Bridger's memory was an encyclopedia. He has a vivid and evidently accurate recollection of details of events connected with his life and his ventures, and would, while sitting at the campfire at night, recite hundreds of events that occurred. So many anecdotes, it would take days to record. And then he goes on to say, I was with him on 2 occasions when the Indians attacked us, and I had the opportunity to observe his tact and coolness, which satisfied me that his stories of the many fights he had with the Blackfeet, Bannocks, and others were not colored. They were actually true. Those kind of tributes and testimonials about Jim Bridger were so prominent throughout the throughout like the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. He died in 1881. He was born in 1804. But he became kind of the classic, the real Leatherstocking tale, the real Hawkeye, if you will, the books by James Fenimore Cooper. And in fact, people from Europe, from Scotland and Ireland, Germany, they came over to the United States to see who are these people being described by James Fenimore Cooper in the 1820s. But they knew the real thing was in people like Jim Bridger and Kit Carson and Tom Fitzpatrick and William Sublett and Jedediah Smith. That group of explorers, they followed maybe 15 years after Lewis and Clark. They became the most adventuresome and the most accomplished explorers in North American history. It's just tremendous, the kinds of things that Bridger did during his lifetime, and the kind of person that he was. He was a person that you would really want to meet. And I wanted to meet him. And that's why instead of golfing on a Saturday or watching basketball, I like to go to the library. And then I started to go to archives and collect authentic original material, letters and documents, what people wrote about him, what they said about him. And it was just an amazing, amazing journey. For those of you in Dubuque, you may be surprised to know that I started actually this pursuit of Jim Bridger before I even became an employee of the Dubuque County Historical Society and the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium. And both of these pursuits, building and help build the museum and aquarium and writing this book about Jim Bridger, in my minds were equal passions for me. At a Monday through Friday job, and then I had a Saturday, Sunday job, and I just enjoyed every single moment of it. So the points I want to stress today, a little bit before I hear from you, he was one of the greatest scouts and guides in American history. I found out through my research that Jim Bridger was one of 8 people originally proposed for Mount Rushmore. Doane Robinson, who was the head of the South Dakota Historical Society in the 1920s, had this idea that people would drive through this park with needles. They're called the rock formations were called needles, and there would be a carving on each one of them. And it would be Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea and Jim Bridger and Buffalo Bill Cody and Kit Carson and 1 or 2 others. And that was the original plan for Mount Rushmore. That's how high in ranking in American history Jim Bridger was. I want to stress that he participated or witnessed in much of America's Western history for 56 years, when he was 8 years old in 1812, all the way to 1868. And as I said before, Bridger is a man that I think you would want to meet. And I've written it that way, that you're meeting him as a person. You're not reading a textbook if you're reading this book, which is pictured here. So I thought I would give you a little bit of a sense of what the narrative is like, what my writing is like. So this starts the very first sentence of the book. It's in this book right here. Jim Bridger left home for the West when he was 8 years old. He had helped his parents keep a farm and an inn near Richmond, Virginia. Now he and his family were traveling nearly 1,000 miles looking for a new life in Illinois Territory, which was the western edge of the American settlements. For Bridger, a brown-haired lad whose eyes were, quote, liquid hazel, bright almost to blackness, the move would change his life forever. By day, they followed dusty roads and rain-swollen streams. By night, they sought shelter, and they talked of dangers ahead. When the immigrants ran out of states, they crossed the territories, the territory of Indiana, which meant land of the Indians, and the territory of Illinois, named for the Illinois people. The year 1812 was a dangerous time for Bridger and his family to travel. The United States was 36 years old then, and it was at war with Britain again, its second time. As the Bridgers moved west, the war moved west with them, and the British defeated the Americans in 3 significant encounters in Fort Mackinac and Detroit in Michigan, and in a place called Chicago, which meant onion field. The Bridgers were traveling a little bit south of those 3 encounters. The Bridgers finally reached their new home in Illinois, across from the town of St. Louis, and they settled at a place called the American Bottom, very close to the Mississippi River. Now, previous biographers have written that Bridger apprenticed to a nondescript blacksmith in St. Louis, and that's not correct. Bridger actually apprenticed to a famous gunsmith named Philip Kramer in Illinois, one of the most skilled gun makers on the frontier, and Bridger, at the age of 13, was learning under him. The reason he was apprenticed was because Bridger's mother died when he was 12. His brother died shortly thereafter, and then his father died when he was 13. So Bridger was orphaned, he and his sister. An aunt came to take care of them, but he needed to get some work. And so he became an apprentice to Philip Kramer. And here's what they said about Philip Kramer. Kramer had a natural genius for working in metal. He was able to make all parts of a gun and put it together as if it had grown fast there by nature. In fact, a reliable person in those days was said to be, he's as sure as a Kramer lock. When Bridger was 17, he was ready for the next phase of his life. Now, some young men were becoming merchants or farmers. Susan Kramer, Philip's daughter, was marrying John Anderson in Kaskaskia, but Bridger was drawn to the river. He had already spent some time actually running a flatboat, or actually helping a flatboat cross the Mississippi River from what's now East St. Louis to St. Louis. So Bridger at 17, he is drawn to the river again. Though the frozen Mississippi River might look like an icy shroud, it still pulsed with life below. Spring would soon break the river free, and it would start Jim Bridger in a whole new direction. There was an advertisement placed in the Missouri Republican, and it said, wanted 100 enterprising young men. Bridger was 17. These 100 young men would ascend the Missouri River. They would need to go well over 1,000 miles by river, and then well over 1,000 miles by land to get to the beaver fields. But Bridger signed up and he was allowed to go. So I want to just talk a little bit about, or set this up. You couldn't read and you couldn't write. So he had to listen to what other people would describe was in this newspaper. He knew he could make $1 or more for every beaver that he caught. And he also knew that it might be dangerous. What he didn't know, and what most of the men did not know, that 1 out of every 5 of them would actually lose their life in the next several years. He planned to send any money he earned back to the American bottom to support his sister. As I say in the book, if he was sharp, he could make his pile, and if he wasn't, he could make his grave. Some trappers saw themselves building their fortunes on beaver pelts, but wives and sisters, they saw their men disappearing to a land of Indians and grizzlies, perhaps never to return. Did Bridger sign up for such an adventure to escape the expectations or the exclusions of civilization? Was it to make his fortune? Or was it to take the measure of the new land and make it his home? He did go up the Missouri River, leaving on April 3rd, 1822. He was a boatman, and the captain of the boat was none other than Mike Fink, the king of the keelboatmen. This might be a good time, Ben, to look at some images. Many of these images are in the book, and some of them I added. Most of them are by an artist by the name of Alfred Jacob Miller, who was brought out to the Rocky Mountain West in 1837. So what are they actually trying to do with this? The point is to trap beaver. And why beaver? Because that was the material that was used to make hats and cuffs and collars and furs. And one beaver pelt could be worth as much as $4 or $5. So this image shows the beaver, and then it shows how the men would actually trap them. And they would find sign. They would have slides where you could see where they've been sliding down the side. You could see their homes that they had made, their lodges. And in the wintertime, you could actually see how the top of the lodge had melted off the snow because they were living in a chamber that was above the water level. Some people wonder, did they ever eat the meat? Well, they certainly did when they were hungry. They would definitely eat the meat of the beaver. If there were buffalo, they would definitely want that instead. The Hudson Bay Company was also trapping out in the headwaters of the Missouri River. And the Hudson Bay Company men were supposedly allocated a daily ration of 12 pounds of buffalo meat for each man. These are a couple of men out trapping. The one on the left, on my left, is setting a trap. The one on the right, he's actually putting a chain into the water, a chain with a ring around it at the end. And the purpose of that is the beaver would actually swim away and take the trap with him. and they didn't want that. So that was to kind of keep him cemented right there. And they would, the next day they would come back, they would usually set 6 traps apiece. And the next day, if they felt very lucky, they would have 3 or 4 furs or pelts. Next. So this is a drawing or a painting. It has 2 different names. One is Lost, and one is the Lost Greenhorn. Bridger at this time was a greenhorn. He was just 18 years old, but he went on to some amazing accomplishments. By the time he was 20, he actually discovered Great Salt Lake, was the first one in the Euro-American group to learn and identify that it was a lake made of salt. When he was 21 years old, he was the first person known to actually run the rapids on the Bighorn River, a place called Bad Pass, where the Crow Indians said that it was inhabited by a great spirit, a Manitou, who would disrupt the waters and disrupt their boat. Well, he went down on a solo version and told his superiors that this would not be a good place to move your furs, so go by land instead. By the time he was 22, he was among a group of people who explored Yellowstone, and this was the very first group of people who explored what is currently the boundaries of, or within the boundaries of what today we call Yellowstone National Park. And by the time he was 26, he was leading groups of mountaineers. He was one of 5 partners of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Next, Ben. So this happens to be Devil's Gate. If you multiply that by 10 times or 20 times the length and the height, you would get something like Bad Pass on the Bighorn River. There was another pass for the Bear River. The Bear River flowed into the northern part of Great Salt Lake, and Bridger went through all 3 of those kinds of places in the West, and they were very common. Next. So this is an image. It's a black and white or just a pencil sketch. It's called Preparing for the Buffalo Hunt. And in a buffalo hunt, it was usually done on horseback, and a good buffalo runner, a good horse, was worth a lot in terms of their ability to actually, shoot buffalo, which they needed for their diet. Next. Now this is a group of some of the trappers, the Mountaineers, and some. They were at this time usually traveling with sometimes Iroquois Indians, Delaware Indians. They were meeting people like the Shoshone and the Crow and the Flathead and the Nez Perce, and they were finding quite a bit of friendship. They were finding quite a bit of hostility from the Blackfeet, who were very much aligned with trading with the Hudson Bay Company and the British, and not in favor of allowing the American trappers to trap their land. Next. This one is called Indian Hospitality. So the man in the blue coat, they're having a pipe ceremony, and they're also talking by hand sign. You see, this is a family. There's a woman with a baby. There's another woman behind. There's a man who's leader of that lodge. And this kind of conversation was very important. And at first they knew sign language. Eventually they learned some of the language itself. Next. This is a picture of Fort Laramie. Jim Bridger was actually one of the 3 owners of Fort Laramie. It was built in 1834 by William Sublette. And it was called Fort William at the time. And then a year or 2 later, it was sold to Fitzpatrick and Bridger and their partners. And so Bridger owned this. Let's take a look at the inside of the fort now. I guess that might have missed that one. So, okay, what you see here is a caravan. And I think it might be a little bit exaggerated as to how many wagons were actually coming out. But the caravan, they developed a system called the Rendezvous. And the Rendezvous was basically an annual summer fair, a trading fair, which wasn't new. There were rendezvous trading fairs at Prairie du Chien on the Mississippi River in the 1780s. Well, this is now 1825 to 1840. And every year, instead of having the trappers bring their furs back to St. Louis and then come back again with supplies, they stayed out. Bridger and the others, they stayed out in the wilds of the Rocky Mountains for the whole winter and the whole summer. And these wagons that you see in the back of that caravan, those are the supplies, which included sugar and coffee, which is very much prized by them, tobacco, alcohol, clothing for themselves, and clothing to trade to indigenous peoples. Next. This is a picture of the 1837 Rendezvous. It's a painting by Alfred Jacob Miller. Bridger by this time was considered the king of the mountain men. He was the leader, and he was many of the people like this man, William Drummond Stewart, who was from Merthley Castle in Perthshire, Scotland. He had come over to the Rendezvous for several years now, and he wanted to do something special. And in his mind, this group of trappers were like unique people, like maybe King Arthur around the round table. Let me read a little bit of what Washington Irving said about this. A totally different class has now sprung up, the Mountaineers. Irving says, the traders and trappers that scale the vast mountain chains, and they move from place to place on horseback. They are heedless of hardship, daring of danger, prodigal of the present, and thoughtless of the future. There is, said Irving, perhaps no class of men on the face of the earth who lead a life of more continued exertion, peril, and excitement. So now a close-up of the Rendezvous. What you see there, there's probably a Shoshone on the white horse, and on the dark horse is Jim Bridger, and he is wearing a part of a suit of armor. He's wearing a helmet with a red plume, and he's wearing what's called a cuirass, which is a breastplate and backplate. And this was given to Jim Bridger by William Drummond Stewart, who came over, who had it shipped over from England, so he could make this as a special gift, as if Bridger was the knight of the Rockies. And then, of course, Bridger let other people ride it as well, and then they were misquoting Shakespeare and having grand fun with the whole thing. So this was one of the foremost rendezvous. Just before the rendezvous started, the Bannock Indians stole several horses, and a fray took place, and there was some bloodshed, and that kind of thing happened often, generally not too often during the rendezvous, but sometimes before and certainly after. It was a perilous time. Next one. Now, this is the last slide I'm going to show you, and it's a little bit unusual. This is about 1/20th of a map that was drawn by Jim Bridger in the dirt with a stick. He was working with Lieutenant William Collins, and Collins wanted to map a lot of the area. The area we're actually looking at right now in the top right, where those purple lines coincide, that is Fort Laramie. And they wanted to get to another fort, Fort Halleck, which was just being established, which is at the bottom left of the screen that I'm seeing. This happens to actually be a drawing that I sent to a map maker. Part of the process here was I selected the images, and it was my job to actually write to the archives or the art museum and seek permission and pay the fees to be able to use this. And then I also then hired a map maker to make the three maps that you'll see in the book here. So that has maps and several images, many of them you've seen. And so that bottom zigzag line, he was guiding Howard Stansbury and showing him where Continental Divide Pass was. Most people were going up and down a hill, or up and down north latitude and south latitude, to go through South Pass. Well, there was another pass which became known as Bridger Pass, and Bridger had just shown Howard Stansbury, who was a captain in the topographical engineers, and making a map in 1850. The other two lavender drawings, one of them is the one that's kind of like not so direct. That was the typical route to get from Fort Laramie to Fort Halleck. What Bridger said, on the way back now, we're going to take a more direct route, and I'll show you the way to go. And he went a direct route, and it was perilous at times, but it became a very possible way to cut off some miles, and or if it was a dangerous route, to avoid those who were maybe waiting to ambush them. So that's all the images that we have. And that really covers Bridger's in a very short way. Bridger's life from the time he was 8 years old until about 1837. In 1840, the rendezvous system ended, and Bridger was still trapping, and he was competing against the Hudson Bay Company. In the 1840s, he built Fort Bridger. The third Fort Bridger was established in 1843. The Mormons came out, the Church of Latter-day Saints, in 1847, and by 1849, Brigham Young was saying to the men in his council, I think Bridger is death on us. And if Bridger knew that 4,000 Indians were coming down upon us to kill us, and if a man was coming to warn us, Bridger would probably slit the man's throat so we wouldn't be warned. There's no real provocation that's been found for why they would say such a thing, but it's something that it was one of the many comments that Brigham Young made. He was a tremendous leader. Some people call him an American Moses, and a tremendous tremendous number of people actually came not only from various parts of the United States, but from England to establish their kingdom in the West. They thought they were going to be living in Mexico territory or in the land claimed by Mexico. And so did Jim Bridger. That's where Bridger's fort was. But with the treaty at the end of the war with Mexico, in 1848, all this became part of the United States. So Fort Bridger was in the United States. Brigham Young and his settlement of Latter-day Saints was now in the United States. In the 50s, there was some confrontation about Bridger's role trading to the Indians, and he was basically forced to leave his fort and his family. He had a Shoshone wife. Bridger had 3 different wives. He was widowed three times, actually. And his first wife was a Flathead woman. His second wife was a Ute woman. His third wife was a Shoshone woman. All 3 of them died after several years as their wife. And he had 7 children. But so Bridger and his Shoshone wife and their children had to leave Shoshone land, and they went to Kansas City. The rest of his life, Bridger's home base was Kansas City, but he spent as much time as he could at Fort Laramie and guiding the U.S. Army out of that fort. And he became a tremendous advocate for peace. When there was going to be a route across the land of the Sioux, the Arapaho, and the Cheyenne, Bridger said, no, there's a safer way through Crow territory. They are our friends. And the Army refused, and those who were trying to get to the goldfields of Montana and Idaho, they also refused. And it ended up in 3 years of war and a lot of death on both sides. And there was a massacre of 80 men, almost exactly 10 years before Custer had his similar massacre, falling for the same ruse that the Indians used to draw him into the attack. Maybe at this point, we can see if there are any questions, Ben.
Jerry, I'm interested in whether or not Bridger ever served in the military as a guide for the military.
Very much so. He was a guide for the topographical engineers, as I said, Howard Stansbury in 1849 and 1850. Then he was guide for Sir St. George Gore, who was really just a hunter. But then he became a guide on the Yellowstone River to G.K. Warren and Ferdinand Hayden. Now, G.K. Warren was one of the noted map makers. So he was part of the topographical engineers. And Ferdinand Hayden, just a few years earlier, had discovered the first dinosaur fossils in North America. And so these were quite 2 very distinguished people, and he guided them along the Yellowstone River. And he told them about the wonderful wonders, the geothermal wonders in Yellowstone. Bridger sold his fort to the Mormons in 1855. There was continued strife between the Church of Latter-day Saints and the U.S. Army. And in 1857, President Buchanan appointed a new governor for the territory of Utah.
The Latter-day Saints wanted to be called the state of Deseret, and Congress refused and made them the territory of Utah. So there were 2,500 soldiers, and Bridger was the chief guide. And during that expedition, Colonel Johnson gave Bridger the title of major. I think it was more honorific, but he was paid, and he was paid quite well. Bridger was usually paid $10 a day as a guide, and the guides working under him were getting $5 a day, and the soldiers might have been getting $1 to $3 a day. So he was very, very highly paid and highly valued. So he guided columns in 1863. He guided a number of expeditions of the Army in 1864. In 1865, he was the chief guide for Patrick E. O'Connor, who actually invaded the lands of the Sioux and the Arapaho and the Cheyenne. Bridger told him not to do that, to go by the Bridger Trail, but they wanted to go the Bozeman Trail instead. So Bridger was chief guide with Connor. And then in 1866, he was also chief guide for Colonel Henry Carrington, who was actually told to not only bolster one of the forts that had been built, but to build 2 more forts in the Cheyenne, Sioux, and Arapaho territory. Bridger was opposed to that all along, but he also knew that his job was to try and keep the soldiers alive, and also to try to limit how much turmoil they would have in terms of warfare with the Indians who had been promised this land in the 1851 treaty. And now the United States did have a clause saying that they had the right to build roads and forts through their lands, and the indigenous people did not understand that necessarily. And so there was, as I said, there were 3 years of warfare, 1865 and 6 and 7. Yes.
But no evidence about him ever having served as a guide for Custer?
No, he never served as a guide for Custer. No,
Okay.
by that time he was retired. There is some mention that his son, Felix, was serving under Custer in Texas in the 1860s. In 1868, there was an interesting thing that involved Custer. By that time, Bridger was retired. His eyesight had gone bad. The Army, I believe it was General Sheridan, was going into the Oklahoma area and and Custer was there, and Custer was planning on leading an attack against the same people who suffered under the Chivington massacre, the Cheyenne. So Bridger actually got on a train and went out to that area and talked to the general beforehand and warned him not to go and not to try to do warfare against the Sioux or the Cheyenne or the Arapaho or any of the other indigenous peoples. They didn't listen to him, but they suffered terribly during a storm. Custer made a disgrace of himself in 1868 and he was actually court-martialed for that.
Jerry, we have a question from Kate Fisher. She says, Jerry, since you mentioned Drummond Stewart, might you share your experience at Ripley Castle in Scotland? I understand the current mayor posted that Stewart's birthday was this week.
Yes. Well, I have several friends out in the West who share this passion for the Rocky Mountain West, the story of the Native Americans, and we developed a program called Three Worlds Meet. And so one world obviously is the world of the indigenous peoples before the Euro-Americans came. Another world are the people like Jim Bridger, who came out there to live like an Indian, like a nomad, like a person who travels with his family. And so anywhere from 20 to 40 men or even more would travel around. They would have winter camp, and there they might build some cabins just for a few months. During the summer, they slept under the skies. But then came this third world, and these were Euro-Americans who weren't living like the Indians. They were still living like white Europeans. And so one of them was William Drummond Stewart, who hired Alfred Jacob Miller, the artist. And just like Catlin and Bodmer, Miller was drawing paintings of the Indians, and so they were bringing in a third aspect. David L. Brown was at the 1837 Rendezvous, and he wrote a tremendous narrative of what it was like. And so suddenly these adventures started to be told, by David Brown and by Irving when he's talking about these mountaineers. And so we actually we auditioned it actually in Fort Laramie, on the outskirts of Fort Laramie, with just some of the people who worked at the fort to be our audience. And then we performed this Three Worlds Meet. It was like a play and we had Willie LeClaire was one of our lead Shoshone actors, and his family came along too. Then we did it in Pinedale and in other places in Wyoming. And then we went over to present this in Scotland, and we had a wonderful banquet at the Merthyr Castle. And then we also did this performance, Three World Meet, in Ireland and in Northern Ireland. And just a note about William Drummond Stewart, he was a tremendous advocate for Jim Bridger. He called him Jem, which I believe that's a typical way to say Jim in Scotland, but he called him Jem, and he wrote about him as Jem. Bridger was in a fray with an Indian called Eagle Ribs. That's new to this book also. Much of the information I'm telling you is new to this book and is not found in earlier biographies. So Bridger was afraid that there was going to be some, we had like, dozens and dozens, maybe 100 of Blackfeet Indians and the same number of trappers. And there was something that caused a lot of discord, and Bridger cocked his rifle. When Eagle Ribs heard that, and by the way, Eagle Ribs at the time was wearing 8 scalps from white men that he had taken. He grabbed Bridger's rifle and tore it out of his hands and bashed Bridger on the head with his own rifle. And then the Blackfeet Indians actually put 2 arrowheads in Jim Bridger's back. This is in 1832. Bridger was 28 years old. One arrowhead was able to come out. The other was so gnarled in there and so deeply embedded, they didn't take it out. And so it kind of wandered around his back, and the cartilage and muscle grew around it. And this is going to get back to William Drummond Stewart in a minute. In 1835, Marcus Whitman comes out as a missionary, but he also happens to be a doctor. He's heading to Oregon to be a mission to the indigenous peoples of Oregon. So Bridger said, I've had this back. See, Bridger had not gone back home ever since he left when he was 18 years old. And he was still living out there in the West, and here was a doctor. So they did open air surgery, probably gave him a little alcohol as anesthetic. He cut in. It was the arrowhead was so severely entwined with his muscles and bone that they actually had to, pull as hard as they could to finally get that other arrowhead out under the direction of our doctor, Dr. Marcus Whitman. So this man from Merthyr Castle, William Drummond Stewart, was there, and he asked Bridger whether he could keep that arrow, and Bridger didn't care. Sure, take the arrowhead. So William Drummond Stewart wrote a book in the 1850s, 20 years later, and he described the scene. And then he said, and as I write this from Merthyr Castle in Perthshire, I have that same arrowhead in my pocket, and I carry it there often. It shows how much he treasured his time in the Rocky Mountains and how much he thought Bridger was so much an admired leader.
Jerry, was there any relationship between Bridger and I guess the infamous massacre of 1857 with the LDS?
No, the only relationship is, well, the massacre, the Mountain Meadows massacre, was, most historians believe that it was brought on by people of the LDS Church who were dressed as Indians, pretending to be Indians, but it was not fully authorized by Brigham Young. Brigham Young, though, had, just as he had spoken so severely about Bridger, he had established what he felt this was good for the church. It was called an era of blood atonement, and that it's important to shed blood. That is the pathway to heaven. And in fact, if you are a Latter-day Saint and your neighbor is doing something that's against the church rules, do you have enough courage to slit his throat and to draw his blood, because it would be something good for him? So this is the kind of rhetoric. We don't know whether it was really taken for real or whether it was just hyperbole, but Brigham Young had a lot of hyperbole. So Brigham Young's rhetoric created the atmosphere for the Mountain Meadows Massacre. The significance with Bridger is Bridger was now, at that very same time, this was September, Bridger was leading the 2,500 troops under Colonel Johnston to actually depose Brigham Young as the governor and put in Alfred Cummings as the governor. So it's not known exactly what other atrocities might happen, but so there's no direct relationship, but it certainly added to the level of fear and caution.
We got one other question in the chat from Lowell's iPhones. It says, talk a little bit about Hugh Glass and how much he knew him. I think Jim Bridger, how much Jim Bridger knew him and their experiences.
Yes, Jim Bridger and Hugh Glass knew each other. So did a number of others. Hugh Glass was kind of a wild spirit, and so they had just had a pretty vigorous attack by the Arikara Indians in the Dakota area, and 13 of General Ashley's men were killed, and a number of horses and other materials were stolen. And then the army came to try and settle the issue, and it wasn't really settled very satisfactorily. But anyway, so Andrew Henry said, okay, this Missouri River is damned to us now. It's the bloody Missouri. Everywhere we go, we're being attacked by the Arikara. Horses are being stolen by the Assiniboine. The Blackfeet are attacking our men, stealing our horses. We need to get off the Missouri River, so we will go on an overland route. So there were two parties, one led by Jedediah Smith and one led by Andrew Henry. So the group that was being led by Andrew Henry, they were attacked by, I think it was at least two Mandan were killed when they were attacking Andrew Henry and Hugh Glass and whoever else was with that group. A few days later, Hugh Glass wandered off the path against orders and was mauled by a bear. Andrew Henry said, he's so bad, we need to get going. We have to get out to the west. This is dangerous. We just had an attack by the Mandans. I want to volunteer to stay with Hugh Glass. The only volunteer was a 17-year-old lad. And therein it comes a historical question. It might have been Jim Bridger, or it might have been another person. But in my mind, whoever did volunteer is somewhat of a hero. He was willing to stay alone. Andrew Henry said, this isn't going to work. We can't just have a 17-year-old. Bridger was 19 at the time, by the way. We can't have a 17-year-old by himself. We need someone else. So a man named Fitzgerald said, I will stay if you pay me. And so they actually made a purse of $40 to be paid. The reason I'm going into this detail, the movie takes a lot of leeways. Hugh Glass wasn't married at the time. Hugh Glass didn't have a son at the time. Those are key elements in the movie. The movie makers did suggest that it was Bridger, and historians have suggested that. But they also, the person who played the part of Jim Bridger said hasn't been totally proven that it was Bridger. So there were those men named James Kleiman from Wisconsin. He simply said that Hugh Glass was mauled by a bear. There was a letter writer, Potts, who said that he was bitten by a bear or mauled by a bear and deserted. And there was a third one who also told the story, Moses Black Harris, who happened to be a person of color, by the way, along with Jim Beckworth, who were out there. And all three of them mentioned this, but didn't mention Jim Bridger. Come about 17 years later, there's a writer who was just become the new publisher of the Louisville Literary Newsletter. And his job was to create, or not create, maybe create in some sense, but certainly record stories of the West. And so he wrote a story which said there were the two people who left were the lad named Bridges and the person named Fitzgerald, and in some writings it's Fitzpatrick. Now there was a Fitzpatrick and a Fitzgerald in that group. There might have been a Bridger and a Bridges in that group. He said it was Bridges, and there was not been too much confirmation. I really don't know, and that's the fun of history. Is maybe the answer is going to come at some point. The main fault, well, to close the story, after 5 days, Fitzgerald said, "We're leaving class," and the boy said, "No, we can't. We should not." He said, "We are leaving, and I'm leaving, and I'm taking all the guns." So the boy had no choice. He had to go along. Again, I think he was a hero. Where he showed a bit of cowardice is when they finally got to Andrew Henry and his men at the fort, which is now at the Bighorn River, where it junctions with the Yellowstone. Fitzgerald said, "Hugh Glass is dead and we buried him." And the young lad of 17 did not contradict the older man and say, "No, that's not true." And he might have been afraid of what would happen to him if he said that. So the Hugh Glass story is true. The desertion is true. But our same man, Stevenson, who was the ethnologist for the United States Smithsonian, he actually served as Bridger's assistant to write letters, etc. And he answered in 1886, he answered a letter, "Yes, Bridger talked about Hugh Glass, but there was no desertion." And by that, I mean, this person was asking about Bridger. There was no desertion by Jim Bridger. So that's the only evidence we have hearsay from Jim Bridger that he was not the one who deserted. But I do favor the lad who did decide to volunteer to stay all by himself. And it was too bad that he wasn't honest at the end, but he didn't have a lot of choice.
Jerry, has the U.S. government acknowledged Bridger's role in the same way as Lewis and Clark? Has there been any kind of acknowledgement of that historically?
Oh, yes. Yeah, very, very much so. So, for example, if you're out in Yellowstone and the Teton National Park, there's the Bridger Teton National Forest. There are mountains named after Bridger. There was a Liberty ship during World War II named after Bridger. There are schools. Believe it or not, there's a Jim Bridger Road just north of Los Angeles where these mansions are selling for $10 to $20 million on Jim Bridger Road. And I think that's funny because Bridger didn't even live in a house for about 20 years. So Bridger is not well known in the East or in the Midwest, but he's extraordinarily well known in the Rocky Mountain West, in California. And he's had a lot of, a U.S. postal stamp was printed in his honor. And so there's been a lot of tributes to Bridger. And a lot of movies. There's actually a wagon train episode called The Jim Bridger Story. The Revenant is a tremendous story. If I can say this on the air, there's a line in Jeremiah Johnson, and the man was saying something like, "I'm the grandson of the man who was," well, I'm going to get it wrong. Oh yeah, my dad was mauled by the bear that bit Jim Bridger's ass. So and then there's one in the movie, I can't remember the author's name right now, but he said, I'm a descendant of Jim Bridger, and that means I fight Indians, and I'll fight anybody, and I'll fight the Nazis, something to that effect. He shows up in popular culture, and the U.S. government is very much recognizing his role. I just find him a tremendous character, and what you'll read in the book is not just a bunch of history and facts. You'll read how he was faced with so many conflicts and how he maneuvered, how he dealt with. For example, Reynolds, after Bridger guided G.K. Warren in 1856 and Ferdinand Hayden on the Yellowstone, they became so enthused about Yellowstone that they wanted to actually explore Yellowstone, and Bridger was going to be the guide. And there was a Captain Reynolds who insisted that he wanted to actually go up the Wind River, and instead of crossing the Continental Divide, going north and then crossing the divide again to get to the source of the Yellowstone. He said, no, there shouldn't be any reason to that. We'll just stay on this side. And Bridger said no. And Reynolds said yes. And Bridger had no authority. He was just the guide. He wasn't the captain. They reached a bluff that was 3,000 feet in height. And he said, see, I told you, even a bird wouldn't be able to get over that, which is a little hyperbole, but he was very frustrated at times because these scholarly engineers, topographical engineers, scientists, they didn't treat Bridger very fairly. They didn't listen to what he knew, and he knew how to keep them alive. There's a statement attributed to Bridger. The best way to stay alive is to keep your scalp tied to your brain. In other words, keep thinking and you'll keep your scalp. And he had lots of good information, and he was often listened to, but too many times was ignored and led to years of warfare and battles that didn't need to happen. He's a real American hero in my book.
Did Bridger leave any writings of his own, of his adventures?
No, he didn't do any writing at all. Well, there is one place called Register Hill, north of Fort Bridger, and it's there is, somebody might have done it for him, but carved in is the name Jim Bridger or J. Bridger Trapper, 1844. But all the documents show that he just did an X when he deeded his land to his daughter. When it was time for them to start farming this land in Kansas City, for the price, he had someone write in, for $1 and all the love that you have given me. So he was a sweet man, a sentimental man. He writes Jim Beckworth in the 1860s, and whoever was writing didn't really have much skill. He said, there's been a good deal, G-O-D-I-L, meaning a good deal. And Linkole is the president, L-I-N-C-O-L-E. So whoever was doing Bridger's writing wasn't good, but it wasn't Bridger. He never wrote, but he did dictate a lot of letters. In 1868, after he retired, he wanted to be the Indian agent for the Crow Indians. And General Sherman, who was the top leading general there at the time, he heartily supported that. So did Robert Campbell. So did many others who were very prominent people, but they wanted to go a different direction, so he wasn't given that. And maybe it was wise. He couldn't read or write. It'd be hard to be an Indian agent without someone who could read or write. But he did run Fort Bridger for a dozen years and did well at that.
And Jerry, Douglas has his hand up. Go ahead, Douglas.
Jerry, let me introduce myself first. I'm Louis Vasquez, who was Jim Bridger's partner for a number of years at Fort Bridger, is my great-great-grandfather.
Oh, really?
Yes. And in 1998, we had a Bridger and Vasquez joint family reunion at Fort Bridger.
I was there. I didn't meet them, but I was there. Yeah.
Well, I'll be darned. Anyway, after that, we formed the Vasquez Family Association. We publish a newsletter about 2 or 3 times a year. I have been working on a book about the Vasquez family for about 10 years. Janet LeCompte, you may know some of her work, shared all of her research materials on the Vasquez family with me before she passed away. Anyway, and I spent many, many weeks in the archives of St. Louis. So I know where you're coming from, and I certainly appreciate what you're doing here. And this book is so badly needed because it's been so long since we had a definitive biography of Jim Bridger. And he certainly will be a part of that 1 or 2 chapters in my book about Louis Vasquez. Louis, of course, was the youngest of 11 children, and the Vasquez family actually had more members of that family and the development of the fur trade from about 1765 on than the Chouteau family had. And they were related to the Chouteaus by marriage. Anyway, I'm just wondering, William Drummond Stewart made several trips. I'm just wondering, why do you think he went back to Scotland and didn't come back?
Because, well, see, when his father died, his older brother, by the rules of his older brother, became the laird. Stewart was simply given a stipend, so he wasn't really in charge of the castle at the Merthyr Castle. Then William Drummond Stewart, I'm talking about like maybe 1830, 31, had an affair with a person named Christine, might have been a laundress, and wanted to marry her. They had a child. The mother and child were not accepted by the rest of his family. And so he provided for them, and he went over to the United States. I think definitely 33 to 38, maybe 32 also. No, 33 was the first. Actually paid $500 to Sublet and Campbell to just escort him out to the Rendezvous, which was a huge amount to just, go along with a caravan of 100 people already. So what brought him back to Merthyr Castle is his older brother died. I think it was in 1838, and then he became the laird of the castle, and all the money and the responsibility was his, and so he lived there. But he brought several people from the Rocky Mountains. He brought Alfred Jacob Miller over to Merthyr Castle to do his drawings. He brought some of the hunters who he had worked with to do drawings and to live at Merthyr Castle. When we visited Merthyr Castle, it was a tremendous experience to know that Alfred Jacob Miller, William Drummond Stewart, and others had been there. And speaking of Louis Vasquez, he was a tremendous friend to Jim Bridger, and a tremendous source that I used extensively. And a lot of my new information comes from the Campbell letters, which are now more and more indexed and available. And so there's so much. I mean, there's transactions of $4,000 worth of for the sale of cattle, and Vasquez comes over. Vasquez owned land in Denver, and so did Bridger. And then one of Vasquez's relatives actually was running the store there. Beckwith was over there too. So there's a lot of interrelationship. And there's a story about Jim Bridger was married to a Shoshone woman, and Louis Vasquez was married to an American woman, a white woman. And Vasquez did not care for, according to one of the Vasquez family, Mrs. Vasquez did not care for Jim Bridger's wife, but if she could get Jim Bridger alone to come over, they would have dinner together with Louis and his wife, but she didn't want the wife to come over necessarily. Maybe there was some discord between the two. So there's some of that in the book also, just the turmoil of, these two families living there, and the census in 1850 counted, I think, maybe 21 cabins or 21 families. There were many, many more Shoshone families, but these were families that had some kind of white, usually male, but in a couple cases, female white leadership of the household.
Jerry.
Oh, how are you, Bruce?
Good to see you. Great talk. My question is this: how far west did Jim actually get? Bridger, did he actually get to the Pacific Ocean or not?
Yeah, he did. He went to, I'm pretty sure, and Frabe writes about it, or Hafen writes about it in the Frabe story, I think.
Okay.
They went to the Pueblo de Los Angeles, and they traded in 1841. And Walker had a visa to enable them to go into Mexican territory.
Okay.
So that was a trip to what's today's Los Angeles, and that was 1841. In 1844 and 5, I think, he led a group down to Cayaterra. And Cayaterra was kind of a mystery for a while because the Hudson Bay Company were writing about it all the time. The only beaver left was in the Cayaterra, and they spelled it with a Q, something like Queaterra.
But the Americans, we found out since then, they were calling it Coyoterra, Coyoterra, which means the land of the coyote people. And the coyote people were the ones who were eating coyote as a primary source of food. And so Bridger led an expedition all the way down to the mouth of the Sea of Cortez, otherwise known as the, I think it's called the Bay of California. And he said it was very barren there, and it was very much a, you know, a land where marshy land where the salt water came in and the fresh water came down. And then he came back by a different route. He went down the route pretty much along the Colorado River route, and he came back coming north to the along the Utah side. And so he came back in 1845, and in 1847, the Latter-day Saints recorded a lot of his narrative of going to that area.
And maybe a follow-up question. I believe Bridger had a child that was at the Whitman Mission at the massacre.
Yes.
And did that child survive that massacre, or was the child killed in that massacre?
Well, she wasn't killed in the massacre. Her name was Mary Ann.
Okay.
And it actually started with an attack on Frapp, F-R-A-E-B, but they called him Frapp.
Okay.
And he and his men had a battle. I think the place is called actual Battle Creek in South Wyoming. And so the Sioux were very aggressive about the Shoshone, and Jim Bridger was living with the Shoshone. So Bridger had to move his fort from the Green River over to Black's Fork. And at about the same time, 1841, he sent their oldest daughter, who was, I think, 6 or 7, to go to the Marcus Whitman family, Marcus and Narcissa. And she lived among them. And there's some very good records from Narcissa about, she was also, another person went there was Joe Meek's daughter, Helen Mar Meek. And so she was not killed in the battle of, or the attack at Walla Walla, but she died the following spring from exposure to weather, trying to escape further attacks by the Indians. So she died as a result of that conflict, but not that specific massacre. Yeah. And that's clarified very well in the book too. And again, I try to tell this, that this is, you know, Bridger's leading his life, and suddenly his daughter dies. Joe Meek shows up at his door and said, "I'm sorry, but my daughter's dead. Your daughter's dead." What a tragic scene. But he just kept on going the way we all keep on going. But it's a delightful way to read about his courage, his generosity, his sense of humor. He was so enthusiastic. If someone wanted to know a direction, he would leap to his feet and he'd grab a piece of charcoal from the fire and he'd draw a map right on his door of his house. Or he'd take a stick and he'd draw it in the sand. Anything he could do, he wanted to share his knowledge about which creek went to which river and whether it flowed east or north or south or west. He knew it and he guided them. And he said, "But don't go there, go here, because that's a poison creek. Go to this one instead." He was for someone who couldn't read or write, he was kind of a savant, the way he could reel back mile after mile after mile what they were going to experience as these immigrants moved, you know, to the next step of their journey.
And then in the chat, we have the question, do you know how his first 2 wives died?
Well, his first wife was said to be named Cora. Family tradition is that she was the the daughter of a Flathead chief. There's no other documentation, and I take that as a family lore rather than a fact. She and Jim had 3 children, and she died. It is said, the family tradition has said that she was bitten by a mad wolf. About 2 years later, Bridger married a Ute woman, and he only had 1 child. Her name was Virginia. And Virginia lived into the 1920s. And it's interesting to see the 1860s, 70s, 80s census. It seems every 10 years she got 1 year younger.
So her birth date is always thought to be July 4th, 1849, but I think the evidence proves in this book that she was actually born in 1848, and therefore Bridger would have married this Ute woman whose name is Chapeta in 1847. Bridger wanted to live with the Ute Indians with his second wife, but there was so much turmoil that he actually had someone write a letter saying, or Vasquez, his friend and partner, wrote a letter saying Jim Bridger wanted to spend the winter with the Ute people, but there was so much turmoil he had to come home again and live at Fort Bridger. And so this second wife did not live very long. The third wife was a Shoshone woman, and she was young. The 1850 census shows that Bridger was 46 and she was 20. And she and Jim had 3 more children. Her name was said to be Mary. The family lore is that she was the daughter of Washakie, who was a very good friend of Bridger. He was a noted Shoshone leader. There really is no other documentation of that she was indeed a daughter of Washakie. She could have been, but it's certainly not proven in my book. So I give it as a family lore, which could be true. And so then so it's also been thought that Bridger only had 6 children. He had 7 children by these 3 wives. It's just been so much fun. I've gone to libraries. National Archives was a huge source of information. The Huntington Library in Pasadena, California was very, very helpful. That's where I got information about him visiting Pueblo de Los Angeles and other information. I was at the Yale University Library, the Bonneke Library there, and actually found a dime novel. Dime novels by Beadle and others were very, they cost a dime, and they were often the subject was someone like Kit Carson. And I'll talk about Carson in a minute if anybody wants to know. So that was a tremendous source. The Missouri Historical Society in St. Louis was very good, but also the Missouri State Historical Society. Utah Historical Society has a tremendous additional material, like when in 1853, Brigham Young got the federal judges to actually issue a charge of treason against the United States of America. Jim Bridger was committing treason by selling either alcohol or guns to the Ute Indians, and so that was one of the charges that they made. And then they had a posse of well over 60 people to come capture Jim Bridger, but Bridger escaped. Bridger was so furious at this that he went to Washington, D.C. Mr. Smith goes to Washington. Well, Mr. Bridger goes to Washington. He travels out with Tom Fitzpatrick. We don't know if they went by train or stagecoach, but they stayed at Brown's Hotel, which was a very famous hotel. Then it became the Imperial Hotel. It's on Pennsylvania, about 6th or 7th Street. It was, and then he talked to Senator Douglas from Illinois, who at that time was leading the Kansas-Nebraska bill to create these two. And there was a lot of slavery issues and other issues. Well, Bridger entered a third issue, which was the Church of Latter-day Saints are out of control, and they massacred people at Mountain Meadows. They took that hadn't happened yet, sorry. But they took my land, and they're opening everyone's mail, and they had all these charges that they had been hearing. So there was great conflict between the Gentiles and the Mormons in the Utah area. Sometimes they lived quite peacefully, but there was a competition for primacy. So Senator Douglas actually wanted to change the boundaries and no longer have this area, which is now Western Wyoming, be part of Utah. Brigham Young was irate, and he wrote to Bernheisel, his aide, who was representing Utah in the U.S. Congress. They were just a territory, so they didn't have an elected representative. The letter he wrote, well, first he wrote Douglas and complained about it. Then he wrote a confidential letter to Bernheisel, the one that he was, helping advise and keep in touch. And he said, if members of Congress think that Jim Bridger is the oracle of all things West, you can tell them that they can kiss my ass, damn you. So that was Brigham Young's message to his compatriot that maybe that's what we should tell Congress. So now that phrase, kiss my ass, damn you, is actually crossed out of the manuscript, but it still exists. Those words are there with the line running through. We don't know whether Brigham Young crossed it out or whether his secretary did it, or maybe Bernhardt when he got it. No, well, this is actually the copy in Salt Lake. But then he did go on to say, Brigham Young, but if Bridger were to come back to Utah and act the same way he's been acting against the laws of this country, he might find himself strung up between the heavens and the earth. So some pretty violent language, some very stirring language. It helped galvanize the Church of Latter-day Saints because it was a difficult religion to maintain so many people all at one time and all the growth of the populations. And so it sometimes, my personal view is sometimes it helped Brigham Young to have Bridger as an enemy that he could talk about and swear about at times. Brigham Young has theoretically said, I know it can be pretty earthy and pretty profane, but I only swear from the pulpit, I don't swear at other times.
Jerry, I'd like to make a parallel, if I could, on Jim Bridger and his kind that explored the American frontier with the recent passing of Michael Collins with Apollo 11 and the moon landing. These people just really like that sense of adventure, the great unknown, and they're different time frame, but I think these people just are important history.
I think that's very true. I think Bridger was also in search of home, and he lost his mom and dad and his brother. He went out west and he stayed there. He found home among the Flathead people, among the Ute people, among the Shoshone people, among all these wandering trappers and traders. He found a home in Fort Bridger where he could meet with people and trade. He just loved the idea of going out, finding new places, and he loved sharing it with everyone. He loved the West so much that even though his family was living in Kansas City, Bridger chose to, even when he wasn't actually being hired by the U.S. Army at Fort Laramie to go on one of these expeditions into the Sioux Territory or the Cheyenne or the Arapaho, Bridger would find a bunk or a place on the floor and sleep in the storeroom where they kept the extra supplies in the store at Fort Laramie. That's how much he loved being there. And then in the daytime, he was found out on the big veranda of Old Bedlam, which is where many of the officers lived. And he would be there telling stories, and he just loved to entertain unless someone said that he was a damn liar, and then he would walk away from them. We have time for one more question.
Okay. Douglas has his hand up, so we'll let him. Go ahead, Douglas.
Just one thing, of course, that we haven't had time to discuss, and I suppose maybe you'll do that tomorrow. The Donner Party problem is worth discussing at some point. Full disclosure, though, if you recall, there was a descendant of Chief Washakie that came to our 1998 reunion, and she seemed to give credence to what you've talked about as far as the relationship there. Do you recall meeting her?
I don't remember meeting her, but in a nutshell, the Donners were, well, Hastings had never been to California yet. He wrote a book about how much of paradise it was, and then he decided to explore it. And he did go over with James Kleiman, and Carson had already been over the route, and Walker had already been over the route too. Fremont had been over the route. So there was some consternation as to whether shortcuts and cutoffs were established all the time. James Reed was the one who made the statement. Bridger says, I talked with Bridger and he said, other than the problems with the desert, it's a fine level trail. Interestingly enough, Jefferson, who made it, not Thomas Jefferson, but a man named Jefferson, a map maker, made a map. He was part of the Donner Party just before the Donners. And he described exactly the same thing. He said it's flat and it's a shortage of water, but you carry water with you. Bridger never gave he's kind of like me, he never gave a one-sentence answer. And so he would have told all about the dangers they might find, as well as, you know, the areas where it might be okay to travel. And Reed had been a fan of taking this route no matter what, and people were arguing against him. And he just put one line from Bridger. I do not think Bridger, I do think there's some thought that some people at Fort Bridger were encouraging them because of the financial gain. I do not think that's not in Bridger's character, and it's not anywhere other ways he's ever acted like that. But anyway, it's handled pretty extensively, well, emphatically, but briefly in the book. I hope you're going to read the book. I've enjoyed writing it, and I'm going to, 2 weeks from now, I'll probably read it again. I like it so much.
I've already ordered it.
Yay.
I have already ordered it.
That's good. But this is the release date today, and it's just tremendous. We've got another talk tomorrow. It's going to be with the folks from the Watkins History Museum in Lawrence, Kansas. And then the Kansas Public City Library, Public Library is going to be May 16th, and then May, I think it's 23rd, is going to be a Boswell book, and that's going to be Jerry Enzler in conversation with Doug Brinkley about this Jim Bridger book.
Yeah.
So our
Jerry,
our host has left, so we could just keep talking, I guess.
Yeah. Jerry, are you located there in near the museum?
Yes,
or
right. Yeah, right near the Dubuque. Yeah, right in Dubuque. I live in East Dubuque now, but we do a lot of our shopping and doctoring in Dubuque.
Okay, well, I am going to be doing a 35-day research trip to finish the book research this summer. I spent a couple of days there in August, so I hope we can get together.
Sure. Yeah, why don't you let me know? You can find me at gmail.com.
Okay, will do.
Yeah.
Harry, I had a question for you. Is there much known about Jim Bridger's sons and daughters? What do you have, 6 children?
He had 7 children. A lot more is known now that this book is published. And there's a number of Bridgers who are out in the state of Washington. I'm just getting some more information from them. And they've, like the Vasquez family, they're continuing to share. There are a number of letters that I found in the American Heritage Center in Laramie, Wyoming, which have 1958 and 59, where they're writing letters about who the descendants are that are still living and which member of the family they're descended from in the Bridger family. And there's also a group of Bridgers in Isle of Wight, Virginia, who think that the first 3 Joseph Bridgers and then the next 3 Jim Bridgers, that's a direct line from the one who came from England in the 1650s, I think, during Cromwell's reign, the first one in Virginia, to our Jim Bridger that we're talking about now, 6 generations. They haven't found it yet, but I think with DNA, they might be able to someday. Ben, that was the last question, right?
Yep.
Are you going to sign us off, or am I going to sign them off?
You can go ahead. Tell them where you can get your book.
Yes, you can. Well, locally, you can get the book at the Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium, and you can get it at River Lights. And you can get it at a bookstore near you, hopefully. I mean, the books are just arriving. A shipment just came in today to the bookstore in Dubuque, because this is the opening time. Some people on Amazon have already gotten it, and we're hoping it's going to be available across the country. I'll be taking a couple of trips to the west, one Pinedale probably in July, and one to Fort Bridger and Salt Lake City in September.
There will be one in the library too.
Yes, there'll be one of these books in the library. So here's the book. There it is. I'll keep moving it. There it is. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I've enjoyed this very much. I hope you have too. And I hope you enjoy the book.